Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 241, and we're going to talk about emotion versus logic, hopium versus reason. Well, I thought about doing this episode for a while, but now it seems kind of appropriate to do it. It's a weird world that we're living in now, post-election. So much pent-up emotion, adrenaline. Uh, especially after all of the polls, the media lies, the intimidation, all of the money that's floating around, and sort of this sinking feeling that, you know, there are so many people who buy into the misrepresentation of reality. And it's not even like uh, the sort of anarcho-capitalist reality is pumping out there. But I mean, there is a little bit of hope, as I talked about in the last episode. But there is also a lot of euphoria, probably a little bit of the endorphins, good vibes, the feeling of vindication, especially on the side of the people who are supporting Trump, or in my case, supporting some of the people who went on board with Trump. There's that feeling of sticking it to all the people who kept talking about listen to the science, or people who talks about the booming economy, and that happened on both sides, of course. And then there's the virtue of supporting death of thousands and the hundreds of thousands of people over there in Europe and the Middle East. But we got to come back to reality, right? So how do we do that? With logic, of course. Now, I talk about emotions a lot in my sermons, and it's likely that people who listen to my daily podcast don't listen to the sermons, and people who listen to my sermons don't necessarily listen to what I say during the week. At least I'm guessing. Um, I don't know, there might be some overlap, but in the event that there is not, I talk about emotions a lot in my sermons, and I like to describe emotion. As an absence of knowledge, right? When you don't have information, you just have emotion. Now, keeping in mind that lots of people like emotion. I mean, I like emotions, right? I have emotions. I used to preach with a lot of emotion and I was pretty good. But what I realized was that when I was emphasizing this emotional aspect, and emphasizing an emotional aspect means trying to get a emotional response from the people who are listening to me. And I could get a lot of people to cry, get upset, or even get extremely happy simply by the words that I said. And so I thought that was pretty cool, but there were no solutions. There was just a lot of platitudes, some interesting stories, maybe the way I presented information demonstrated a certain level of language mastery, perhaps. But if you wanted to really help people, then you had to somehow equip them or give them something with which they can move forward with their lives. But when you're just dwelling with emotion and manipulation of emotion, then you sort of give people that good feeling, which lasts for a little while, and then reality hits them again. And so they're right back to where they started. So anyone can feel, anyone can live with emotion, except for, of course, the psychopaths and the sociopaths. In other words, babies feel, that's all they can do. They feel hungry, they feel pain. And whenever they do that, because they can't communicate, they just cry. There's no information in their brain with which they can communicate. They can't speak. They don't necessarily understand what it is that you're saying. And even if they did, they wouldn't know how to respond. They wouldn't know how to explain what they're thinking, what they're feeling. And without that language, then how do you organize your thoughts? How do you somehow use information to understand what's going on around you? And then when that little baby starts to learn a little bit, all of a sudden it becomes a little know-it-all, self-centered brat, right? And I saw this thing where this nature documentary thing where Babies are cute, which is what helps parents not, you know, do vicious things to them, right? And you're like, oh, you're driving me crazy. Oh, but look at you, you're so cute, right? And that sort of lovableness is seen all throughout nature, right? So that's why little puppies or kittens, they're all very cute and cuddly, and that's supposed to be the reason why, right? So it prevents them from being, unalived, as it were. But if they remain with that kind of temperament, with that kind of behavior as they get older, then it's not so cute anymore, right? Some people might like it, but it gets old pretty fast, right? So if you're still acting like you're 6 years old when you're 20 years old, yeah, it's not very attractive. It doesn't matter what gender you are, right? It's just not appealing. Um, So we're not supposed to use our emotions for important decisions, right? At least that's sort of the conventional wisdom, right? So we feel things, we uh, sense things, but when we have to make an important decision, we use our logic, we use our brain, we use the information that we have to be able to make a good choice. So now let's talk about logic. If we want to use our logic, and I'm not just simply talking about the logic that you learn in philosophy class, but I'm talking about just basic reasoning. And in order to do that, to be able to make conclusions, postulate, or even imagine what would be the result of a certain action, it requires learning and understanding. So we can, on one level, imagine, like, if I do this, then I'll get what I want. But then with more complex situations, you have to understand that there are other forces working against you. There are other people competing for the same object, for the same goal, which means you have to use more information and better understanding to plan out your strategy. I talked about this a little bit in my episodes on Sun Tzu and the art of war, right? Everyone is on the same playing field. Everyone is dealing with the same natural phenomena, geography, weather, fatigue on the part of your soldiers. Everyone has the same limitations. So then, what are you going to use to your advantage in order to attain victory or to have victory in that confrontation? So we use our logic, we use our knowledge, our information, our understanding to be able to plan out what we want to do. And so it's very forward looking. It is not immediate, right? And so emotions, if you want to think about an extreme expression of living only with emotions, it's that mantra of live in the moment. Living in the moment means you just enjoy this moment for what it is. You don't think about the past. You don't think about the future. Just live in the moment. Well, yeah, I mean, that basically is a justification of not needing to learn what you need to learn. So, in contrast to that is logic, where the more information that you have, you cannot help but think about the future, the consequences of whatever choices that you make now. And so, the people who tend to live with more logic in their lives, generally are more forward looking, are more serious about the consequences of the choices that they make today. And I saw this myself when I was in college, and I would try to get other people to, mess around in the way that I was. And they were saying, no, 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 I got a test tomorrow. I got to study. And I'm like, what? What do you mean a test tomorrow? So it would be that, I mean, because I was an idiot, and I was finally free from my Asian family living out in a dorm. I could do anything I wanted. And so I had that sort of breakout celebration of independence at the very wrong time. But anyway, so people who live with their emotions, they're more about the now, the immediate, the temporary. There's no expectation, there's no worry. But then, of course, when the bad consequences hit you, you pretty much whine like little babies. So as we get older, we're supposed to figure out that we need more knowledge and understanding. We need to make more logical, rational, reasonable kind of choices and decisions. And so, how does this play out in a life? In other words, what does this look like if you live only with emotion or with logic? So, one example of living with emotion would be to go to college because you're supposed to, and that's where you can party. And hey, you can get all these loans that make it affordable. And then after 4 years of a lot of partying and choosing a major that's really easy, but doesn't give you any job skills, you are unemployable, right? So you have a massive debt and you can't get a job. And so a person in that situation then gravitates to the explanation that, hey, we need loan forgiveness. And it's because of institutional racism and other social injustices for the worker that you can't get a job, right? So it has nothing to do with your life choices that you made before, right? It's just that the system is unjust. People who want to focus only on emotions, invariably, you're going to talk about love. Love conquers all, right? And I talked about love several times in the past, and I try to make it always humorous, but love is actually very serious. Love is a very powerful emotion. And believe me, if you're in church and you start talking about love, you just need to have a couple girls in your Bible study or fellowship group, and they just really reject this explanation of love, right? That I have anyway, right? That love in scripture can't be emotion, right? Because God is not emotion, right? He doesn't do things on the whim or because he has a down day or because he has an up day. Or, God is absolute, which means he's always going to be the same. And so people always, though, of course, using their emotional understanding of the word love, right, which is just filled with raging hormones and dreams and fantasies of romance and lust and whatnot, they want to put that on God too. But that's not really that. So emotional love is that raging hormones, that person's hot, and so you want to be with that person, all that stuff, right? Emotion. And just know that emotional love can quickly become hate because they're both emotions, right? And so the distance from love and hate, there's that song by the Pretenders, it's a thin line between love and hate, right? And, I wondered about that, but it's because they're both emotions and they lack knowledge and information. And so we just respond with the feelings that we have. Either the feelings are good feelings or bad feelings. Now, love of logic, right? So the love of is justice, right? And so basically, this whole tension between emotion, which is based on not having any information at all, then you make all of these rash decisions. You want to just not think about the consequences of the decisions that you want to make now. And then you get upset at people who call you on it, right? Who draw attention to the consequences and also draw attention to the choices that you made, which led to you having this situation, which is the consequence of your early choices. And then you have the flip side, which is that you are going to love with logic. And now, what is love with logic? Love with logic is justice, right? Otherwise, it's just favoritism, which is hypocrisy, which is injustice, right? So emotions give you injustice, and logic gives you justice. So virtue signaling, all emotion, there's very little substance, which not only is unjust because you're just emphasizing one aspect of it with little understanding of how it came to be and how to resolve it, but it also leaves you vulnerable. So people who participate in the virtue signaling culture, they are easy marks for people who seek to use them, right? If you want to launch a protest, if you need a big crowd, yeah, you're going to do virtue signaling. And all the suckers, all the people who live on their emotion, who live right on the surface of their lives, they show up, right? And it becomes really easy to participate, but also to pretend, right? So if you show up somewhere and it's all emotion, it becomes easy to pretend, right? So for example, the example that I used to always give when I talk about it in church is that if you have very little academic or intellectual substance to whatever it is you're talking about and discussing, well, it's just all emotion. And so people can pretend. For example, when a lot of people who want to date someone who goes to a church, well, you just find out what that church teaches makes is a well, you just have to learn what the church teaches is a sign of being a believer. And then you just do all the things that they say is the mark of a believer. And so you pretend, and they make it public what those qualifications are, right? Because they want people to uh, marry someone who thinks a lot like them. But of course, if you're just really attracted to the person, you don't care about anything else, it makes it very easy for you to be a player in that congregation, right? So wolf in sheep's clothing, if you will. And that's what happens when you live with emotion. You make it really easy for other people to take advantage of you, to manipulate you. Now, in contrast to that, if you live with your logic, with your reason, you're going to try to build networks of trust based on information, right? Now, as we live our lives, and you can do this through, what do you call it, references or track record, or trying to get the personal history of other people and just see how the teachings of a congregation play out in life. Does it help people's lives get better? Does it help them to avoid some of the pitfalls that a lot of people seem to go through? Or is it not helpful at all? Bear in mind, we will still and always wrestle with our emotions and our logic, right? Without logic, our emotions are simply ignorant. So, what I always say is once you have a lot of knowledge and understanding, your emotional response becomes more informed, right? Of course, there will always be that, you know, hormone fueled emotion, and that's something that we have to deal with, but we use our logic to bring that under control. So without logic, then our emotions are just simply ignorant. They are directionless. They are guideless, if you will, principle without principle. But then without emotion, our logic doesn't have any empathy or compassion. So we need both for a fuller life. That's obvious. But our logic must always guide and maybe even protect us from our emotion. And I thought about the Romulan versus the Vulcan dichotomy. And if you're a Star Trek fan, then you know that Vulcans, which is Mr. Spock, is tries to suppress all of his emotions, whereas the Romulans, which is the same species, but they because they're on a different planet, they get isolated. It's just sort of that biology thing where they choose to embrace their emotions. So they're very warlike, very militaristic, right? Very emotional, right? Well, you need to have some sort of balance, right? To have just an extreme makes it very difficult for other people to relate to you or even to be successful in life. Um, but what's interesting is that because all of us are different, we will make our choices, take our opportunity to depart logic or depart emotion and make certain kinds of choices at different times, right? For different things. And so, since all of us are always going to do this, right? So, the virtue signaling culture is an aberration, right? And so, it's sort of this, what do you call that? The trending phenomena that you see on TikTok and whatnot. Excuse me, that has sort of twisted the whole logic and emotion balance. And so then there becomes an overrepresentation of either emotion or of logic for different things. But if in a society that is more free, each individual will make their choice or choose the time where they will sort of use less logic or more emotion or less emotion and more logic for different things at different times. And so society kind of balances that out. You don't see these wild swings, which are then manipulated by people running for office in politics, right? And so when people do this at different times, then the rest of us, we get to either see what other people have done as a lesson or as an example, right? As a lesson, what not to do, or an example of what to follow. So some of my more recent episodes illustrate what happens when there's just simply a lot of emotion, right? So the virtue signaling, the race theory, elections, war, who's the enemy? We got to get that guy. All of this emotion just raging, which then leads to mindless, irresponsible choices. But if we can temper our emotion, right? So we have those feels, but then we say, okay, let's check this against the information that I have, then it can protect us. It can guide us to better choices, better reaction, and sort of reduce the suffering and the heartache and just the misery that so many people experience today. I thought of doing this episode primarily because of the euphoria that a lot of people are feeling because of the Trump election. There's a lot of pain coming, right? That reality cannot be escaped, right? 36 trillion dollars of debt. That's pain. And, hopefully some of the people that Trump has recruited onto his administration, and who knows who he's going to pick for what jobs, um, I think will be kind of interesting. Like I'm kind of holding my breath. Like I'm not allowing the euphoria to make me forget that, hey, he made some pretty bad choices last time. So hopefully he's a lot wiser. He knows more about Washington, D.C. And in the time between lawsuits and, being attacked in the media and by the court system and the legal system and law enforcement, that he had time to network with the right people, to talk with the right people, to get the right people on board to be able to proceed logically, rationally, in the best interest and the best way for the American people, for this country, and for everyone who wants to be left alone, like me, so I can practice my faith, practice and live my life in the way that I want, uh, and be left alone, right? And not be harassed or lose a job because I said the wrong thing. But that's what I want for myself. This is what I want also for everybody else. That's it for this episode. Perhaps a little bit of logic to mitigate some of the hopium that's going around these days. And hopefully, all of us will be able to have realistic expectations, but also assist in that task of educating people about what needs to happen in society if the United States wants to move forward in a positive direction. That's it for today. I'll talk to you next time.